It was noon, yet when you looked up at the sky, the sun was dead, with no light at all. There was only a murky orange haze. Thick like clotted blood, it swallowed Beijing's skyscrapers whole. You tried to take a deep breath, but what flooded your lungs wasn't oxygen. It was millions of coarse, jagged dust grains, sharp as glass. They would tear your windpipe, making your chest seize violently. Amid the choking, hacking coughs, welcome to the end of breathable air. More than 620 miles away, Seoul had completely vanished from satellite maps. Namsan Tower was wiped from view. Visibility was under 6 feet. All that remained were disaster sirens wailing in despair, mixed with the ear-splitting grind of metal from chain reaction crashes on Tokyo's elevated bridges. The subway system was totally paralyzed. Millions of commuters were trapped inside underground train cars beneath the earth, fighting over the last scraps of clean air from gas masks that had already turned pitch black after only minutes. This isn't science fiction. This is a nightmare called the Super Yellow Dust Storm, an imagined scenario where nature decides to strip humanity of the right to breathe. When the Gobi Desert rises up, merging with industrial smog to form a colossal meteorological monster, turning all of East Asia into a deadly gas chamber. Could you survive 72 hours in this living hell? 48 hours before hour D, it was a strange afternoon. The silence of the Gobi today didn't feel like any other day, heavy, sticky, carrying the stench of rusted metal. The nomads who lived along this border, lifelong companions of wind and sand, were the first to sense something was wrong. The Bactrian camels suddenly went berserk. They snapped their tethers, reared and screamed, then all at once spun around and bolted south at full speed. Up in the sky, thousands of migrating birds flying in formation suddenly began dropping one after another onto the barren ground, like autumn leaves. When people picked up their bodies, they saw the birds' eye sockets were blood red, and their beaks were packed with fine, razor-like sand they had suffocated mid-flight. At the monitoring station, meteorologists were staring at the radar screen, faces drained white. Atmospheric pressure readings were free-falling insanely. The wind speed needle didn't wobble anymore, it was pinned at maximum, buzzing as if it were about to explode. A massive low-pressure zone deep and bottomless like the eye of a demon was forming at the desert's epicenter. But even worse, the Gobi's ground temperature, already baked by 6 straight months of drought, suddenly began evaporating violently as an enormous cold air mass from Siberia surged south at supersonic speed. Imagine a pan of oil boiling at 572 degrees Fahrenheit, and you suddenly dump a gigantic block of ice straight into it. The extreme temperature difference, hot air blasting up from the ground and frigid air crushing down from the north, triggered a massive pressure explosion. Not fire, but wind. Tornado-like vortices formed instantly, twisting together like giant snakes. They churned up the desert surface, already loose and powdery from lack of water. The ground began to tremble, not from an earthquake, but from the movement of billions of tons of matter. The topsoil of millions of desert acres was ripped away, pulverized, and sucked up into the sky. Heavy, coarse sand grains skimmed low over the ground like bullets, scraping everything clean in their path. But the real danger lay in the fine dust, lighter, more toxic, carried by the cyclone all the way up into the stratosphere. It merged into the jet stream and began its journey of spreading death. 24 hours before hour D, at the China-Mongolia border, a wall of sand had formed. From a satellite view, you'd see a yellow-brown beast thousands of miles wide, devouring every patch of green across the Asian continent. Down on the ground in Baotou, Inner Mongolia, people began to feel suffocated. The sky shifted from blue to pale yellow, then quickly turned a dull orange, like the color of old X-ray film. As the storm swept across rare earth mines and gigantic smelting complexes in Inner Mongolia, it armed itself with a deadly chemical arsenal. The once barren dust particles were now coated in poison lead, mercury, arsenic, and tons of sulfur dioxide. A simple sandstorm had evolved into a colossal acid cloud, a moving chemical reactor racing toward the planet's most crowded cities. 12 hours earlier, Beijing was still running like a tireless machine. Skyscrapers reflected the weak morning sun. But inside hospitals, doctors began to notice. a sudden spike in respiratory emergencies. Children were admitted struggling to breathe, with swollen eyes and rashes across their skin. Elderly people suffered mass asthma attacks even while staying indoors with windows shut. The National Early Warning System started issuing cautious signals, yellow alerts, then orange, but the speed of this beast was faster than anything supercomputers had predicted. It wasn't moving at the speed of a seasonal wind, it was riding an extremely powerful jet stream. Then that moment came. At exactly 10 a.m., on Beijing's Third Ring Road, drivers inching forward in bumper-to-bumper traffic suddenly saw a colossal black shadow rise on the northwest horizon. It towered overhead, completely blotting out the sun, looming like a Himalayan mountain range made of dust, collapsing down on the city. No one had time to understand what was happening. Smartphones buzzed all at once. The screens glowed red with an emergency alert, red warning: seek shelter immediately. But it was too late. The storm struck not with a roar, but with a physical collision. A brutal pressure wave slammed into glass buildings, making countless high-rise windows shudder violently. Some reinforced panels couldn't withstand the force and exploded outward. They sprayed down onto the asphalt like hail. In just 3 short minutes, day turned to night, and sunlight was completely snuffed out. Streetlights switched on automatically, but they were only faint specks in an ocean of choking dust. Visibility dropped to a perfect zero. Cars moving at 50 miles per hour suddenly slammed into a thick wall of dust. Brakes screeched, scorching the road. Then came the horrifying chain of metal-on-metal collisions. Hundreds of vehicles piled up into a burning, chaotic battlefield. But even the flames couldn't fully erupt because the dust was displacing the oxygen in the air. Pedestrians on the sidewalks were the first victims and the most tragic. Fine dust reeking of raw earth and the sour sting of chemicals blasted straight into their noses. Their first instinct was to cough, but the more they coughed, the deeper they inhaled, driving millions of razor-edged particles straight into their alveoli. Their throats felt like someone had poured hot sand down them, burning, ripping. Tears and mucus streamed down their faces, but instantly mixed with the dust, turning into sticky black sludge streaked across their skin. They collapsed, clutching their throats. Eyes rolling back, they searched for air, but all around them was a deadly yellow void. Office building ventilation systems, instead of filtering the air, became gigantic pumps of poison. Fine dust pierced standard filters, crept into every corner, and coated desks. Computers, even half-finished cups of coffee with a yellow-brown powder. Office workers panicked and surged toward the emergency stairwells, creating a horrifying stampede in the darkness. At the same time in Tianjin, the gateway port city, the sea grew heavy and dark. Dust fell so thick onto the water that it formed an oily-looking film on the surface. Giant cargo ships completely lost their bearings. Marine radar was thrown into chaos. A container ship with a displacement of 110,000 tons went blind in the dust storm and slammed into a pier pillar with an impact that shook the entire city. The crack of buckling steel thundered through the air. Containers crashed into the sea like bombs detonating. Civil defense sirens screamed wildly, blending with the wind shrieking through window seams into a terrifying symphony of the apocalypse. The monster had swallowed northern China, but its hunger wasn't satisfied. It was licking along the Yellow Sea coast, and its murky gaze was locked straight onto the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago. And this was only the overture. If Beijing was where the monster struck first, then Seoul was where it displayed its most refined brutality. The dust storm crossed the Yellow Sea, and in the process, it didn't weaken at all. On the contrary, it sucked moisture from the ocean, turning dry dust into microscopic, sticky, acidic mud droplets. Seoul's sky was no longer yellow-orange. It shifted into a thick reddish-brown like the color of necrotic flesh. In the bustling Gangnam district, chaos began with electronic billboards. Massive LED screens on skyscrapers flickered, then exploded. Fine dust, electrically charged as particles rubbed against each other in the air, unleashed sickly blue static lightning. It struck straight into the ground power grid. Substations blew like fireworks in a chain reaction. The entire south bank of the Han River plunged into darkness, but this darkness wasn't quiet. It was thick with car horns, screaming, and shattering glass. The dust didn't just attack lungs, it attacked infrastructure. Nano-sized dust particles slipped into the servers of top tech conglomerates. Cooling systems clogged instantly. Microchips overheated and melted. The internet of one of the world's best connected nations went completely dark. GPS failed. Seoul residents, people accustomed to living by technology, suddenly became blind in a concrete maze. The respiratory ward at Seoul National University Hospital had collapsed 2 hours earlier. Hallways were packed with bodies sprawled everywhere. No beds left, no stretchers left. Patients lay on the cold floor, convulsing in waves. Look at that middle-aged man. He's clawing at his own throat until it bleeds. His already weak lungs are reacting violently to dust concentrations 50 times above the allowable limit. The ventilator beeped frantically, then flattened into a long, lifeless tone. Exhausted and desperate, doctors were forced to make the cruelest decision in medicine. Triage. Anyone still young, anyone with a chance of survival, received an oxygen tank. The elderly and those with underlying conditions were left behind with high-dose sedatives. The storm moved at 124 miles per hour, riding an extremely powerful jet stream and shooting straight toward Tokyo like an arrow. Japan, a country famous for meticulous disaster preparedness, was still completely caught off guard by this scenario. They build seawalls against tsunamis. They build houses to survive earthquakes. But they have no wall that can stop the air in the sky. At Haneda Airport, a flight tried to land in desperation. The pilot couldn't see the runway. All laser altitude sensors were scattered by dust density that was far too thick. But the most terrifying thing was happening inside the engine: molten silica dust. As the jet engine sucked air into the combustion chamber at 2,552 degrees Fahrenheit, millions of fine sand grains melted instantly into liquid glass. That glass coated the turbine blades, warping aerodynamics and clogging ventilation holes. Passengers screamed. Oxygen masks dropped but were immediately covered in dust. The plane rolled sharply to one side and slammed into Tokyo Bay, sending a towering column of pitch-black, mud-thick water blasting into the sky. Tokyo's subway system, the safest shelter in everyone's mind, now turned into a deadly trap. The subway ventilation system was designed to filter normal dust, not to filter a mudstorm. When the filters overloaded and blew out, dust surged into tunnels dozens of yards underground. At Shinjuku Station, the busiest train station in the world, panic surged to its peak. Thousands of people were packed shoulder to shoulder on the platforms, the air suffocating, oppressively hot, oxygen thinned by the second. People began trampling one another in a desperate push back up to street level, but the escalators were jammed solid with the dead and the injured. Inside a train car stranded in a pitch-black tunnel, the emergency lights flickered, illuminating faces turning blue-purple. A young woman tried to cover her small child's mouth with a handkerchief, but the child had stopped crying a long time ago. His tiny chest no longer rose and fell. Around them, dry, rasping coughs echoed like hammers pounding on coffins. On Ginza streets, luxury boutiques had their windows smashed to create shelter, but inside was dust as well. The service robots, Japan's pride in technological innovation, staggered, then collapsed. Their joints seized up with sand. Police and self-defense forces tried to deploy armored vehicles for rescue, but even military air filters clogged after just 30 minutes of operation. The massive tanks lay motionless in the streets, like dead boulders slowly buried under yellow dust, falling like snow, and acid snow that was toxic, scorching, and filthy. On NASA's satellite screens, all of Northeast Asia had vanished beneath a gigantic brown smear. No national borders, no coastlines, only the absolute rule of dust. Nature doesn't need nuclear bombs to erase a civilization. It only needs one gust of wind and a little sand from a forgotten desert. After shredding the Chinese mainland, the colossal dust storm surged out to sea. There, it found a new accomplice: water vapor. Billions of tons of bone-dry dust, heated red-hot by friction and loaded with sulfur and nitrogen oxides from industrial zones, began drinking in seawater. A massive chemical reaction unfolded right in the sky. The storm was no longer just a dust storm. It transformed into a colossal acid mud cloud. And when its weight became too great, it began to pour down. Survivors hiding inside buildings heard heavy, creeping thuds, like someone was throwing tens of thousands of handfuls of wet mud against the windows. The skies over Seoul and Tokyo started raining a thick, reddish-brown liquid like rusty iron mixed with blood. Wherever it fell, white smoke rose. At Gyeongbokgung Palace, the centuries-old curved roof tiles began to bubble. The gilded lacquer and crimson paint corroded instantly, exposing the wood and stone beneath as they darkened from chemical burning. Great bronze statues of generals, symbols of national pride, were drenched by the reddish-brown flow. It ate into their eye sockets, making them look like they were crying black blood. Down in the streets, the steel shells of millions of cars began to peel. The acid mud rain was so concentrated it chewed through paint and gnawed into metal frames. Windshields turned permanently opaque. Modern electric cars, once the pride of green technology, now sat dead in place, their lithium batteries under the chassis soaked by acid. Short circuits ignited terrifying fires. Worst of all was agriculture. The smart farms outside Osaka and Tokyo, which supplied clean food to tens of millions, were wiped out completely. Acid mud seeped through thin greenhouse membranes, falling directly onto hydroponic vegetable beds. Within hours, all vegetation withered and turned coal black. The soil was poisoned with heavy metals and deeply acidified, so deeply that scientists estimated it would take at least 50 years for a single blade of green grass to grow here again. But the real catastrophe, the one that would shake the world across the ocean, was unfolding inside the cleanest rooms on Earth. Semiconductor chip plants in South Korea and Taiwan, the heart of global technology, were falling, even with the most advanced air filtration systems installed. No filter was designed to withstand fine dust density this extreme. For 24 straight hours, the filters overloaded and blew out. All it took was a single speck landing on a silicon wafer during photolithography, and that entire batch of chips was ruined. And right now, it wasn't one speck, it was billions of particles invading the temples of technology. Production lines sounded red alerts across the board and were forced into emergency shutdowns. The news spread faster than the speed of light. Trillions of dollars in market value evaporated in minutes. Investors understood that without chips from Asia, the Western world would be thrown back into the Stone Age of the 1970 seconds. No new iPhones, no EVs, no fighter jets, no AI servers. East Asian governments, after the first helpless hours, made harsh decisions unlike anything in human history. In Beijing, Seoul, and Tokyo, environmental martial law was declared. At the highest level, the military took full control of streets flooded with acid, mud, and sand. Armored CBRN vehicles rolled in silently. Soldiers in stark white protective suits, sealed head to toe like astronauts, carrying automatic rifles. Their orders were clear and cold. Shoot anyone who deliberately tried to leave the shelter zone. Major cities were divided into sectors. Bridges over rivers, mountain tunnels, were blocked by military concrete barriers. No one was allowed out. No one was allowed in. Millions were confined inside their own homes, with food and drinking water dwindling hour by hour. The national healthcare system collapsed completely. The government was forced to requisition arenas and covered stadiums as centralized oxygen stations. But there wasn't enough oxygen. Bloody riots erupted right outside the doors of the oxygen stations. People trampled each other, beating one another with clubs, bricks, and stones just to win a single tiny compressed air cylinder. From an underground command bunker, the president sent a desperate plea to the United Nations through the last remaining military satellite link. His voice cracked and choked. This was no longer one nation's problem. Asia's lungs had collapsed. But the world answered with a terrifying silence. Nearby countries were trembling too, sealing their borders tight, afraid the cloud of death would shift in their direction. In the instant between life and death, people always choose selfishness as their final shield. Outside, the storm still howled. Wind shrieked through the skyscrapers, sounding like Mother Nature's mocking laughter at humanity's fragile arrogance. And when night fell for the third time, a lethal silence blanketed all of East Asia. No lights, no traffic, only the thick mud rain thud like a countdown to total erasure. 3 days later, the wind finally stopped screaming. The sun rose, but the light was sickly, pale, struggling to pierce the remnants of the toxic haze. Welcome to the New World. A cold Mars in the middle of Earth. Beijing, Tokyo, once dazzling capitals of light, now lay silent like enormous graveyards, buried under a 12-inch blanket of ash and dust. No more green from plants. No more black asphalt. Everything was coated in a uniform yellow shroud. Deadly, dull, and endless. Supercars, parks, towering monuments, now nothing but anonymous mounds rising and falling across a vast sea of sand. Silence covered everything. A bone-chilling post-apocalyptic stillness. No birdsong, no engines, only wind slipping through shattered window frames, forming mournful, sobbing sounds. The survivors crept out of their shelters, eyes sunken from sleeplessness and fear. They looked at the world they once knew, now alien and hostile, like a dead planet. They began cleaning in despair, using shovels to scrape away the acid mud that was eating into their homes' foundations. But some things could never be cleaned away. Sharp silica dust, permanently embedded in the alveoli of hundreds of millions. The hacking coughs, the wheezing. The scarred, fibrotic lungs would become a haunting, lifelong aftermath for an entire East Asian generation. This yellow dust storm wasn't a random punishment from nature, it was a mirror, reflecting exactly what humans had done. We stripped away the desert's green armor. We pumped industrial poison into the bloodstream of the atmosphere. And now, nature simply returned it all, back into our own chests. Earth doesn't need nuclear firepower to erase humanity. It only needs one gust of wind and a little dust. Today's hypothetical scenario is over. But remember this, if we don't change, tomorrow when you open your window, that deadly yellow sky may be the last thing you ever see.